The prairie was quiet that night, save for the wind whispering through the dying grass and the low groan of the barn door. The silent cowboy sat alone, his weathered hands resting on his knees, staring at the empty stall where his horse once stood. That horse had carried him through dust storms, gunfire, and winters so cold even the stars seemed to freeze. But now it was gone. Sold. And not by strangers or thieves, but by his own sons, who had traded loyalty for a handful of silver. The betrayal cut deeper than any wound he'd ever taken on the frontier. He didn't raise his voice. He never did. Silence had always been his armor, his answer to a world that spoke in violence. But behind that calm, his heart ached, not for the loss of the animal, but for what it meant. His sons had sold more than a horse. They had sold the last piece of his dignity, the final remnant of a life that had once meant honor. As the night deepened, he sat beneath the flickering lamplight, his eyes distant, carrying the weight of a man who had seen too much and spoken too little. The town, ever watchful and cruel in its gossip, whispered that the cowboy's best days were long behind him. They said the old man had nothing left worth stealing, no fight left to give. His silence, once seen as strength, now made him seem small, almost invisible. Even his sons, blinded by greed and pride, saw him as a burden, an aging relic who no longer mattered. They did not understand that beneath that silence still burned the spirit of the frontier itself, proud, unyielding, and bound to things that could never be bought or sold. Far beyond the town, where the horizon met the dark hills, rode a different kind of man, the giant Comanche, known to all who dared cross the borderlands. He was fierce and silent in his own way, a man of few words but of unbroken code. When he heard what had been done to the cowboy, something stirred within him. The bond between horse and rider was sacred, not just to cowboys, but to warriors. It was to betray the very spirit of the land. And so, as dawn crept over the ridge, painting the plains in hues of gold and red, the ground began to tremble beneath the gallop of hooves. The giant Comanche rode through the mist, leading the horse the sons had sold. His presence was like a storm breaking the silence of the prairie. The old cowboy, still seated on his porch, looked up as the first light touched his face. The horse neighed, a sound that split the dawn, and in that moment, without a single word spoken, respect was restored, and honor returned with the rising sun. The morning light fell softly over the small ranch, but the silence that lingered there was heavy, almost sacred. The cowboy stood by the corral, his hat pulled low, the sun glinting off the silver in his beard. His horse, his companion through years of hardship, was back where it belonged, grazing quietly as if it had never left. Yet the peace of that moment could not erase the sting of betrayal. The sight of his sons watching from the doorway, their eyes filled with shame, cut deeper than any wound from the past. They had sold his horse to strangers, not knowing that the stranger they'd sold it to was a man the West itself feared to cross. The night before, when the Comanche had appeared at dawn, leading the horse through a veil of dust, the town had frozen in silence. His size alone commanded attention, broad as the horizon. His presence seemed to silence even the wind. Without a word, he had handed the reins back to the cowboy, a silent acknowledgement of something no money could buy: respect. It was not pity that brought him there, but understanding. In the Old West, there were few laws, but among the few that mattered, loyalty stood above them all. The sons, standing by in disbelief, didn't understand what had just taken place. To them, it was a horse, valuable, yes, but replaceable. They had sold it for coin, believing they had done nothing wrong. But as the giant Comanche's dark eyes passed over them, they felt something more than fear. They felt the judgment of the plains itself, the weight of dishonor pressing down like a desert sun. In that single look, they saw the truth their father's silence had never needed to speak. Some things, once sold, can never truly be bought back. The cowboy, though silent as ever, nodded once to the Comanche. Words weren't necessary between men like them. They were both bound by the same understanding of respect, the kind that came not from talk, but from action. As the Comanche turned his horse and rode away into the rising light, the dust he left behind carried more meaning than 1,000 speeches could. It was a message to every man watching. In the Old West, honor had a language all its own, and only a few still spoke it. That morning, as the cowboy approached his horse, he placed his hand on its mane, feeling the warmth of life and loyalty beneath his palm. The animal snorted softly, brushing against him as if to say, "We're home." For the first time in many years, the cowboy felt something stir within him. Not pride, but a quiet peace. He didn't look at his sons. Not yet. Some lessons in the West weren't taught through words, but through silence, and this silence would echo louder than any reprimand. The following days moved slowly, heavy with unspoken truths. The townsfolk, who had once pitied the silent cowboy, now looked at him differently. They spoke in low voices about the morning when the giant Comanche returned the horse, about the way dawn itself seemed to stand still as the two men faced each other. It was as if the land had chosen to remind everyone of something they had forgotten. That respect was not a thing of value. It was the value. The story spread beyond the town, carried by travelers and traders, growing into a legend whispered around campfires across the plains. For his sons, the weight of shame grew heavier with each retelling. They couldn't escape the whispers, the stares of those who once envied them, now filled with quiet scorn. Their father said nothing, never raised his hand nor his voice, but that silence was more unbearable than anger. Every time they saw the horse grazing in the corral, its steady calm seemed to mock their recklessness. They had sold a symbol of loyalty, and in doing so, betrayed the man who had given them everything. One night, unable to bear it any longer, the eldest son approached his father. The old man sat by the fire, sharpening his knife beneath the low light of a lantern. "Pa," the boy said softly, his voice trembling. "I didn't understand." The cowboy paused, the rhythmic sound of stone against steel fading into the crackle of flame. He didn't look up. He didn't need to. His silence was not punishment. It was reflection. It was the sound of a man who had seen enough of the world to know that words mean little compared to truth. The son continued, tears welling in his eyes. "We thought it was just a horse. We thought you wouldn't care." The cowboy finally raised his eyes. They were not angry, nor cold. They were simply tired. He spoke, his voice low and steady, each word deliberate as if carved into stone. "A man who sells what's loyal loses more than he can count." That was all he said. The boy lowered his head, the words cutting deeper than any shouted rebuke ever could. By morning, the sons rose early and began working before their father could even ask. They mended the fence, carried water, and tended to the animals with newfound purpose. The cowboy said nothing as he watched them from the porch, his pipe resting between his fingers, smoke curling into the soft morning light. Change, he knew, didn't come through punishment. It came through the quiet understanding of what had been lost. And in that silence, the first seeds of redemption began to take root. The following weeks unfolded beneath a relentless sun. The earth cracked beneath the weight of drought, and even the toughest men began to feel the strain. Yet the silent cowboy worked the land as he always had, slow, steady, unyielding. His sons followed his lead, their pride now tempered by humility. They didn't speak much anymore, but their actions began to tell a new story. For the first time, they understood the rhythm of their father's silence, the way he listened to the wind before he sowed seed, the way he studied the color of the sky before rain. The West, they realized, spoke not through words, but through endurance. Each night, as the family gathered around a modest fire, the sons watched their father with new eyes. His face, worn and lined by years of hardship, carried the quiet dignity of a man who had given more than he'd ever received. There was no bitterness in him, only resolve. It struck them then that their betrayal had not broken him. It had merely tested a strength they had never seen. The horse, once just an animal in their eyes, now stood as a living reminder of the bond they had traded so carelessly. One evening, as the orange glow of sunset faded into the horizon, the youngest son approached the corral. He placed a hand on the horse's neck and whispered an apology it would never understand. But somehow, saying it made the weight in his chest a little lighter. The cowboy watched from the porch, unseen, a faint glimmer of pride softening his gaze. He had never been a man of many words, But that moment spoke louder than any confession could. Rumors of the Comanche's act continued to spread. Travelers who passed through the town told the tale, in every saloon and trading post, of the warrior who returned a horse to its rightful owner at dawn. Some said it was an act of honor. Others swore it was a sign of a deeper connection between men who lived by the same code. Whatever the reason, the story became part of Western legend, and with it, the silent cowboy's name carried further than he ever intended. But for him, fame meant nothing. What mattered was the quiet shift inside his family. His sons, once blind to what their father stood for, were learning what no teacher could ever teach: the weight of respect, the cost of betrayal, and the long road toward redemption. The cowboy knew it would take time, but time was something the West had plenty of, and patience was the one thing he had never run out of. One night, long after the town had gone to sleep, a soft knock echoed against the cabin door. The cowboy rose from his chair, the wooden floor creaking beneath his boots. When he opened the door, the moonlight revealed a towering figure on horseback, the giant Comanche once again. His presence seemed carved out of the same earth they both rode upon, unshaken and timeless. He dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate, his silence echoing the cowboy's own. No words were exchanged for several moments. The two men stood facing one another, the prairie wind whispering between them. Finally, the Comanche spoke, his voice deep, calm, and resonant like thunder rolling over distant hills. "A man's worth," he said, "is not what he owns, but what he keeps sacred." He looked toward the corral, where the horse stood quietly, then turned his gaze back to the cowboy. "You kept what was sacred, even when others forgot." The cowboy nodded, his expression unreadable. He reached out his hand, not in gratitude, but in mutual recognition. Two men from different worlds, bound by the same code that few still understood: honor without reward, respect without need for witness. They shook hands beneath the moonlight, and for a moment, time itself seemed to pause. The West had always been divided by boundaries, land, blood, and pride, but this handshake crossed them all. The sons, awakened by the sound of the horses, watched from the window. They saw not two enemies from different tribes, but two men who shared the same kind of strength, the kind that comes from silence, integrity, and the understanding that some acts of goodness require no explanation. That night, they learned what their father's words could never have taught: that honor is not spoken, it is lived. When dawn broke once again, the Comanche was gone, leaving only hoof prints in the sand. The cowboy stood by the corral, watching the sun climb over the hills. For the first time, his sons joined him there, side by side. No one spoke, and none needed to. The horse snorted softly, the wind whispered through the grass, and in that silence, everything that needed to be said was already understood. The following months carried the quiet rhythm of redemption. The ranch, though modest, began to breathe again, its fences mended, its fields worked by hands that now understood labor not as a burden, but as a form of respect. The sons rose with the dawn beside their father, no longer needing to be told what to do. Each swing of the hammer, each shovel of earth, was an apology spoken through action. The cowboy never mentioned their betrayal again. He didn't need to. The land itself had taken over the lesson, teaching them through sweat and silence what words could never reach. There was a new stillness around the house, not of shame, but of peace. The sons began to see the quiet not as their father's weakness, but as his language. They noticed how he paused before decisions, how he read the wind before storms, how he tended to the smallest things, like brushing the horse's mane each night as though it were a ritual of gratitude. That horse had carried him through years of loneliness, and now it had become the thread that wove their family back together. One evening, the eldest son stood beside his father at the fence line. The sky burned gold and red as the sun dipped behind the horizon. "Pa," he said softly, "you ever forgive us?" The cowboy took his time answering, his eyes fixed on the fading light. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost carried away by the wind. "A man don't hold on to bitterness," he said. "It poisons what he's still got left to protect." The son nodded, tears filling his eyes. It wasn't just forgiveness he'd been given. It was the chance to become the kind of man his father had always been. The town, too, began to change its tune. What had once been gossip turned to quiet admiration. People came to see the silent cowboy not as the man whose sons had betrayed him, but as the man who'd rebuilt his family without anger, without revenge, and without a single word wasted. His silence had become legend, a kind of wisdom few could grasp but all respected. The same men who had once laughed behind his back now tipped their hats when he passed. And though he never sought it, the cowboy's story began to spread again, carried in hushed tones from one settlement to another. They spoke of the man whose horse was stolen and returned, whose silence could humble men, and whose strength came not from his gun, but from his grace. The tale grew with each retelling, but those who knew him understood the truth. His legend wasn't built on glory or revenge. It was built on forgiveness, and the quiet power of a man who knew that true strength never needed to shout. One bitter winter morning, a letter arrived from a nearby town. The cowboy's eldest son brought in, brushing snow from his shoulders. It bore the seal of a cattle trader, a man known for his greed and arrogance. The letter spoke of trouble. A group of settlers had been cheated out of their livestock, their families left hungry as the snows deepened. The Comanche, too, were suffering, their hunting grounds stripped bare by the same trader's deceit. The West had always been cruel, but this act went beyond cruelty. It was theft of survival itself. The cowboy read the letter in silence, his weathered face unreadable. Then he stood, took his hat from the wall, and began to saddle his horse. His sons watched, uncertain if they should follow. The eldest finally asked, "Where are you going?" The cowboy answered without looking up, "To return what's been stolen." There was no anger in his tone, only duty. In a land without law, some men were the law simply because they lived by it. They rode out before dawn, the three of them cutting through the cold wind like shadows against the snow. The world was quiet, save for the sound of hooves and the faint jingle of reins. When they reached the trader's outpost, the man came out laughing, his coat lined with fur, his hands fat with greed. "You come for what's yours, old man," he sneered. The cowboy dismounted slowly, his every movement deliberate. "Not mine," he said. "What belongs to others?" His voice, though calm, carried a weight that made the trader's grin falter. The confrontation that followed was not marked by violence, but by a kind of moral reckoning that left its mark far deeper. The cowboy stood tall, unarmed, and yet no man dared to draw against him. His sons stood beside him, not as boys, but as men who now understood what it meant to carry a name worth respecting. By sunrise, the stolen cattle were returned, the settlers saved, and the trader left to face the silence he had earned. When they rode home through the frost, the sky slowly brightened with morning light. The youngest son looked at his father, his heart swelling with pride. "Pa," he said, "how do you know he'd give it all back?" The cowboy smiled faintly beneath his hat. "Some men don't fear bullets," he said, "but they remember what silence means when it comes from someone who's lived right." The boy didn't answer, but he understood. The West had many heroes, but few carried justice in silence the way his father did. The weeks that followed brought with them a strange quiet, one that settled over the land like snow and stayed in the hearts of those who lived there. The cowboy's sons worked harder than they ever had, driven not by guilt anymore, but by pride. They had seen what silence could do, how a man's wordless strength could mend what anger could only destroy. The cowboy himself had changed too. His silence, once heavy with sorrow, now carried something lighter, like a peace earned after a long war. The horse, once the symbol of betrayal, had become something else entirely. It was no longer just a beast of burden, but a living reminder of loyalty restored. The sons took turns tending to it, brushing its coat until it shone under the sun, each stroke a quiet vow that they would never again trade what was sacred for what was easy. The father never spoke of it, but when he saw the animal being treated with the same reverence he himself had given it, a faint smile often touched the corner of his lips. The town began to notice. Those who had once mocked the silent cowboy now sent their sons to learn from him, not through lessons or books, but through work, through watching how he handled the land, the animals, and the weight of being a man in a world that gave nothing freely. They came to see that silence, when it came from wisdom, was louder than pride. The cowboy never sought to teach, but the West has a way of turning quiet men into teachers all the same. One afternoon, As the sun dipped low and painted the prairie in gold, the youngest son spoke softly to his father. "Pa, how do you know when a man's done enough to make things right?" The cowboy looked out toward the horizon, his eyes reflecting the fading light. "Ain't about making it right," he said. "It's about living right, so you don't lose yourself again." The boy nodded slowly, the weight of those words settling deep into his bones. He would remember them long after his father was gone. And so, the days went on. The wind carried the scent of rain and dust. The land continued its endless rhythm of hardship and harvest, and the silent cowboy's legacy deepened, not in wealth or words, but in the quiet strength of a family that had once fallen apart and learned to rise again. The West, harsh and unforgiving as it was, respected those who could endure it, and endurance had become the heart of their story. But the peace that had found the ranch would not last forever. The frontier was not a place where calm stayed long. It was a land of storms, both of sky and of spirit. One night, word reached the town that the giant Comanche had been ambushed by bounty hunters far to the south. They had come for his land, for his freedom, for the legend of his strength. The sons heard the news first and told their father, expecting anger or fear. Instead, the cowboy simply nodded, his expression unreadable. "A man like that," he said softly, "don't fall easy." Still, something stirred within him, something deeper than words could reach. Before dawn, he saddled his horse, the same one that had once been taken from him, and prepared to ride. His sons followed without question. The bond between the cowboy and the Comanche was not one of blood, but of honor, and in the Old West, honor was thicker than any kinship. They rode under a gray sky, the wind sharp and cold, their silence saying more than any plan could. When they found the trail, it was marked by violence. The ground was torn, the dirt stained, but no body lay there. The Comanche was gone, his tracks leading toward the hills. The cowboy dismounted, crouched, and touched the earth where the tracks faded. His eyes closed briefly. "He's alive," he said. The sons exchanged looks. They didn't ask how he knew. Men of the West didn't need proof when instinct spoke. By nightfall, they found the camp where the ambush had taken place. The fire was dead, the air thick with the scent of smoke and iron. And then, from the shadows, a figure emerged. The giant Comanche, battered but unbroken, leading a wounded horse. When he saw the cowboy, a faint smile crossed his face. No words were exchanged, no gratitude spoken. They both knew what it meant to stand for something when the world tried to take it away. That night, as the two men sat by a new fire, the sons listened in silence. There was no talk of revenge, no boasting of survival, only the crackle of flame and the deep understanding that in the West, men like their father and the Comanche did not live for glory. They lived for what was right. And that kind of life, though quiet, echoed far beyond the plains. It became the kind of story the land itself would remember. The dawn that followed was still and pale, a soft mist rising over the plains, as if the earth itself wished to rest after so much struggle. The cowboy and the Comanche rode side by side, their horses moving slowly through the dewy grass. Behind them, the sons followed, quiet and watchful. The air carried the smell of smoke and pine, and though no words were spoken, the moment felt sacred. Two men who had once been strangers now bound by an unspoken brotherhood, born not of circumstance but of principle. When they reached a ridge overlooking the valley, the Comanche halted and turned his gaze toward the horizon. His voice, low and roughened by battle, finally broke the silence. "The West remembers men who stand true," he said. "Not for what they win, but for what they protect." The cowboy nodded, his eyes following the sun as it rose, casting long golden lines across the land. He understood. In a world that would one day forget their names, their deeds would remain etched in the dust, carried by the wind. As they prepared to part ways, the Comanche handed the cowboy a simple token, a feather bound with a strand of leather. "For your sons," he said, "so they remember what silence can mean." The cowboy accepted it without ceremony, tucking it into his coat. No words of farewell were exchanged. None were needed. Respect, once earned in the West, didn't fade. It simply lived on, quiet and eternal. The sons watched as the giant Comanche rode away, his figure disappearing into the wide expanse of morning light. They would never forget that sight, the way strength could look so calm, so still, so unshakable. It was the same strength their father carried, though his shoulders were smaller, his steps slower. That day, they understood that greatness wasn't measured by size or fear, but by the weight of one's silence and the truth behind one's actions. When they returned to the ranch, the air felt different. The horse neighed softly from the corral, as if welcoming them home. The cowboy dismounted, his movements deliberate, his mind heavy with reflection. He hung the feather by the barn door, where the wind could touch it each morning. To the sons, it became more than a keepsake. It was a reminder of what their father had taught them without words, that in a world loud with pride and greed, true men built their legacy in silence. Years passed, and the West began to change. The iron rails of progress carved through the land, and the wild places grew smaller with every season. The cowboy grew older, his steps slower, his hair now the color of the snow that capped the distant mountains. Yet even as the world moved on, his name still lingered in the whispers of the plains. Travelers still spoke of the morning the Comanche returned the horse, of the man whose silence commanded more respect than any gun ever could. The sons took over the ranch, but they never changed its ways. They kept it simple, honest, and true to the values their father had lived by. Every morning, before the day's work began, they passed by the feather hanging on the barn door. It swayed gently with each breeze, its movements soft but unending, just like the lessons the cowboy had left behind. Even after his voice was gone, his silence remained, echoing through their choices, their words, and the way they carried themselves in a world that often forgot what honor looked like. When the cowboy's final day came, the sun rose just as it always had, slow and golden, stretching across the endless plains. His sons gathered by his side, not with sorrow, but with gratitude. He did not leave them wealth, nor a land beyond what they could see. What he left was greater, a legacy of respect, of endurance, of understanding that strength was not measured by what a man could take, but by what he could endure without bitterness. As they buried him beneath the same oak that had shaded their home for years, the horse stood nearby, still and solemn. The youngest son tied the feather to the old man's saddle, letting it flutter softly in the wind. He never needed to speak, the eldest murmured, because the land always spoke for him. The words hung in the air, heavy with truth. In that moment, silence once again became the language of love, respect, and finality. And so the legend of the silent cowboy lived on, not in shouts, nor songs, but in the quiet strength of those who remembered him. The story passed from father to son, from campfire to campfire, until it became part of the very soul of the Old West. Because in a land of noise and pride, there was once a man whose silence changed everything. And at dawn, when the wind moves softly through the grass, it still carries his name. In the end, the story of the silent cowboy was never about loss. It was about redemption, honor, and the unspoken power of integrity. What began with betrayal and silence became a lesson that echoed across generations. His sons, once blinded by greed, learned that a man's worth isn't measured by what he owns, but by what he stands for when the world turns cold. The cowboy's voice may have been quiet, but his actions spoke with the force of thunder across the plains, reminding all who heard his story that silence, when born from truth, carries farther than any words. The giant Comanche's return of the stolen horse was not merely an act of justice. It was the meeting of two souls who understood the sacred code of the West. Both men, shaped by struggle and bound by respect, proved that honor transcends borders, blood, and history. It is the one language spoken by all who live with courage. Their bond, forged in the dust and dawn of the frontier, became a symbol of something the modern world too easily forgets. That respect is not given through power, but through principle. As time passed, the cowboy's silence became legend. The townsfolk told his tale, not because of what he said, but because of what he showed. They spoke of the man who rebuilt his family without raising his voice, who found justice without firing a gun, and whose legacy was carried not by pride, but by peace. His story wasn't about taming the West. It was about taming the storms within a man's own heart. And that perhaps is the hardest frontier of all. There is a moment in every life when the world grows loud, when pride and anger demand to be heard. But the cowboy's tale reminds us that real strength is quiet. It's the choice to stand tall, to forgive, and to do what's right even when no one is watching. In his silence, he left behind a map for every soul lost between noise and meaning, a path back to dignity, to loyalty, to the kind of honor that can never be sold or stolen. If this story spoke to your heart, take a moment to share what it stirred in you. Tell us what silence means in your own journey, and how you define strength in a world that never stops shouting. And if you wish to ride further with stories that carry the same soul and truth of the Old West, subscribe to this channel, leave your thoughts below, and keep this spirit alive. Like the cowboy's quiet legacy, your voice, your presence, can help these stories echo far beyond the sunset.